Welcome to the video on number 40. We're still in air pollution here, and we're going to talk about smog and acid rain and deposition today. So we'll start with smog. This is an aerial footage, right, satellite imagery of what looks like India here. And so we get some of that Asian side of the world. But this brown cloud here is all a type of smog. And so there's a couple different types, and we're going to go how do they form and what are the different types of smog. And so the two big types here are photochemical and industrial smog. Photochemical, the important part of this word is the beginning part, the prefix. Photo meaning light. This is smog that forms due to sunlight, and we'll talk about what that means. And then industrial smog is a different type of smog caused by a different set of compounds, and so we'll talk about that as well. But typically we're talking about a combination of primary pollutants and some secondary pollutants in here, especially with photochemical smog. There has to be a reaction that takes place in order to produce it. Smog usually happens due to a thermal inversion, or at least cases of smog kind of get exaggerated by thermal inversions. What a thermal inversion is where typically you've got warm air rising up from the city because you've got a lot of pavement there, which is going to absorb sunlight and generate heat, or kind of trap heat into there. And warm the air up, and so that air rises up. But a thermal inversion can happen when there's a layer of warm air that forms over top of the city, usually because there's surrounding mountains here that prevent any kind of winds to blow that air out from the side, and so you end up with a warm band of air up top, and so the air below it ends up cooling off a little bit. Typically, like when the sun's setting in the afternoon, you've had a lot of time during the day to heat up the air, and you establish this really warm band above, and it starts to cool down a little bit below, and that air can't escape. And so whatever kind of pollution is being generated in here, car exhaust, for example, is a big problem here, is trapped, and it can't escape because it can't rise past that warmer layer of air. So we'll start with photochemical smog. This is known as brown smog. It's photochemical, meaning that it requires light, and that light is going to be from sunlight. Nitrogen oxides are the cause here, the main cause of this, and we tested these in our air pollution of vehicle exhaust lab. And so these nitrogen oxides, along with some VOCs, are going to get broken up by UV light. And when that happens, it produces a couple different things. Ozone is one of those things, aldehydes are another one, PANs are another one, and some other secondary pollutants. I'll show you the reaction here on this page. And so this, in the bottom right, this would be a picture, I believe. It's a city out west, maybe Los Angeles. But you can see this brown or this gray photochemical smog here that has formed due to this process. And so what happens, we've got our temperature inversion, preventing the pollutants from rising. We've got a mountain. It's really trapping in the pollutants that are produced. And so typically what happens, we've got stage one, which is the accumulation of pollutants. This would be the morning and early afternoon. And so people are driving to work in the morning. They're producing a lot of exhaust in rush hour traffic. And throughout the day, they kind of build up in this kind of trapped inversion zone. And so these are the emissions that we're talking about. This is NOx. Any time of those nitrogen oxides. When they react with oxygen and sunlight, they're going to start forming NO2, which is then going to be able to split apart and create a free oxygen atom. That free oxygen atom is where we create ozone, O3. And when you get these particles forming as a result, NOx again, VOCs and SO2, those are going to create these solid haze particles in the atmosphere, and that's what we can see as the gray smog. So typically we would see stage 2 happening in the afternoon of the day, because in the afternoon you've got, again, a lot of people out on the road, so you're getting a lot of these primary pollutants starting off with, and you also have a lot of heat there, and there's a lot of sunlight there. And so it's typically the afternoon rush hour is when this gets the worst. And then once the sun goes down, you run out of the sunlight, and the haze is going to kind of break up. And it's a cycle where you get it kind of every other day. Some effects with it. Obviously, it's going to impair visibility, but it also is an irritant to the eyes and respiratory tract. So it's not something you want to get in your lungs or in your eyes. And over time, it can damage crops and trees. because they're going to be pulling in air into their cells to go through photosynthesis to filter out the carbon dioxide, and these things can build up in there. So it's not good to have in there. Like I said, it peaks in the early afternoon because you've got warm air, and you also have a lot of cars that have been driving on the road. And then once the sun goes down, it kind of disappears. Los Angeles, Denver, and Salt Lake City are the top cities for this because we're really dry there. Water can, like if you have a lot of precipitation rain, it can pool out those pollutants and get them trapped in the water molecules that are falling through the air and then wash them away. And you also have a lot of mountains around these cities. Gray smog. So the other type here is industrial smog. And industrial smog comes from burning sulfur-containing compounds. When you were listening or watching the Beijing Olympics, you couldn't avoid them talking about the smog problems in China. And this is because a lot of their coal is bituminous coal, not the anthracite coal. And so it's got a lot of sulfur in it, which when we oxidize sulfur plus oxygen will yield sulfur dioxide. And these sulfur oxides are going to be up there in the air where you've got water vapor, and that water vapor then can add to the sulfur dioxides, and it will form sulfuric acid, which is H2SO4, and that sulfuric acid is going to form a solid up there in the air, very small particulate acid particles, and they kind of just float around and get trapped there. And so it's solid, so you can see it. It's industrial smog is what we call it. The big places for this are China and India. In the United States, it's not a big problem because we have a pretty good supply of anthracite coal, so our coal is pretty low on sulfur to begin with. And then we also have scrubbers installed on our power plants, which we'll talk about later, but they extract the sulfur dioxide from the burning process. They take it out before the air is released, and so you capture it and remove it. Some factors that can contribute to gray smog. If you add sea salt and winds to this, it's obviously going to reduce the pollutants because the sea salt is going to kind of trap some of this, and the winds will kind of blow it and spread it out over a larger distance, so you don't have a big concentration of it. You can see just how intense this can get, and kind of the worry around the Olympics in Beijing were, would you be able to see the events happening, or would the smog be so bad? And thankfully they were able to kind of avoid some of the worst parts, but it certainly played a role. Some athletes decided not to go because they didn't want to be breathing in the smog and affect their lungs. The grasshopper effect. This is the only slide we're going to get on this, but it's an interesting thing. We've talked about these kind of global climates before and how the air currents move throughout the world through the Hadley cells, the polar cells, and the Ferrel cells. The interesting thing is up in Antarctica, and especially in Antarctica, researchers realized that there's a really high amount of pollution up there, and you can see in this picture of the same location, we have gray smog forming in Antarctica, and we don't have power plants in Antarctica. There's no exhaust from automobiles in Antarctica. So how did these pollutants get there? And the answer is that they are deposited due to these polar cells and these global wind currents. If you look at the direction that the wind is going to be moving, it's actually pushing these pollutants, right? We cycle them through here up to our horse latitudes, and then they can split. Some of them will go back down towards the equator, but some of those pollutants will go up further. And once they get through the Ferrel cells here, again, they split. Some will go back down towards the equator. Some will split and head towards the poles and up and up and up and up until they get deposited up here. And so it can kind of gather up on the poles, and you get kind of strange concentrations based on how few people live there. I'm going to skip this slide for now so we can get through the rest of the stuff. Acid deposition and precipitation are an important thing to talk about here. I see a lot of questions on these on the released APs, multiple choice and free response. So please feel free to ask questions afterwards and make sure you understand this process pretty well. The process of acid precipitation and deposition starts with these two compounds. The NOx, remember, can come from car exhaust, and the SO2, this is typically going to be from coal burning You can also get it from other types of fossil fuels for power, like petroleum or crude oil stuff. But at any rate, so these two things are released in the atmosphere. They get oxidized, and we've talked about how sulfuric acid can form once it oxidizes. It reacts with the water in the air, similar to our nitric oxides. And when they've reacted with the water, they can split apart into their ions, right? So they'll dissolve in water into their ions, and then when it rains, they get dropped into the soil in the form of all these different ions, which can do a lot of different things. We'll kind of talk about what they do. The other aspect is if it's a dry climate and there's not a lot of moisture in the air, these two things are solids, and these two things are solids, and so they will just kind of naturally fall particulates. They're solid particles, and so gravity will eventually win and pull them back down to Earth, and they get deposited in the soil as soil material. What does that mean for us? So it means a couple different things. It can have an effect on certain sculptures. So this is a marble sculpture, and marble is reactive to acids, and so it's actually dissolving over time. You can see in 61 years what change this statue had due to acid rain. It can also lead towards what you see in this picture. The leaves of plants are very susceptible to this. The higher acidity in the rainwater can corrode the leaves and kind of wear them out. We can get fish kills if you get a lot of it in one area. Concentration spikes in acidity, and the fish can't tolerate it. It denatures their proteins, and they pass away. It can also carry nutrients, right? So it reduces the tree's ability to take them up, but it can also carry nutrients deeper into the soil and away from where the roots are. So a lot of different problems with acid rain and acid deposition. But these are all caused by either these two compounds interacting with the leaves in the soil or these ions interacting with the leaves in the soil. And that's where we'll stop today for the video. So 12 minutes seems like a pretty good place to stop. Thanks for watching, and please bring notes and be prepared to discuss in class tomorrow.